the whole psychology of fighting is different for infantry men. And I think the behavior of Urquhart on the day he arrived, which is to leave headquarters because the communications were poor and to go forward to find out what was going on, also underlines his misunderstanding of airborne warfare, which is that you drop a lot of people behind enemy lines and the enemy are all around and you don't quite know where they are. So, frankly, for a divisional commander to go forward in an airborne scenario is always a very dangerous thing to do, because what you've got with airborne troops, they're infiltrated between the enemy. That's what was intended at Arnhem. And you don't know how many enemy have been left behind. Therefore, there's a very high chance that people following on are going to become casualties. And of course, that's acceptable if they're reinforcement troops, but it's not acceptable if they're a divisional commander. So again, I think that was an element of naivety, overconfidence. I've got to show these guys what's what. And he paid dearly for it because he's effectively out of the running. I think I said for 36 hours, which is the first 2 nights of the battle and the second day of the battle, when really it's won or lost.
Hello. Arnhem was one of the greatest battles fought by the British in World War II. 10,000 men went in, but only 2,000 came out. And we're at the 80th anniversary as Saul David joins to discuss the plan, the personalities involved, and the action itself in this first of a special series on Operation Market Garden. Saul is the author of Sky Warriors, which is an account of British airborne forces throughout the war. Today we'll get Saul's take on the plan, the intelligence, and whether everyone did their job. Coming up on Wednesday, Al Murray joins to chat one crucial day of Arnhem, the 19th of September 1944, Black Tuesday. Then next Saturday, Gordon Corrigan and Philip Blood join to discuss the wider operation as a whole, before we end our special series with the Film Club and A Bridge Too Far. Please do share with the like-minded, and thank you to those who've given a rating. That's very kind of you. Plenty more great history on the way, but in the meantime, I'm going to hand you over to me and Saul David talking Arnhem. Saul, welcome back. Great pleasure to have you on again and to talk about Sky Warriors for another operation, another 80th anniversary, and this time it is Operation Market Garden and the Battle of Arnhem. But welcome, Saul.
Yeah, thanks, Saul. Great to be back. It's odd, isn't it? 1944, 2024. 2 of the biggest operations in the story of Sky Warriors, the British Airborne, took place in the same year, and now we're all that time ahead of that.
Well, this operation, I was thinking about this. Presumably, I was interested to get your thoughts actually, because is this operation the most famous of the Second World War for the airborne forces? Because whilst Pegasus Bridge, which you gave a brilliant discussion on and the podcast did so well, so Pegasus Bridge is obviously attracts a lot of interest, but Operation Market Garden, because of A Bridge Too Far, perhaps, is that the best known of the airborne operations performed by the British?
Yeah, without question, it is. The film makes a big difference, Ollie. We know this from one of my previous books, Zulu, the film Zulu, and I stress the film Zulu rather than Zulu Dawn, which wasn't anything like as successful. But the film Zulu about the defense of Rorke's Drift is iconic, still shown today. And as a result, we know much more about the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which after all was a minor border skirmish than we do about just about any of the other major battles of the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. So a feature film does make a difference. Having said that, there was another big feature film also made off the back of a Cornelius Ryan book, and that was The Longest Day, in which the Pegasus Bridge story does feature, front and center. So there's no particular reason, just because of the feature film, why Arnhem should be better known even than Pegasus Bridge or Operation Tonga, which was the whole 6th Airborne Division mission on D-Day, apart from the fact that we as the Brits do love a glorious failure. And I think there is no more glorious failure in the Second World War than this. And, and I include other events like, for example, the campaign leading up to Dunkirk. Lovely quote by Churchill after everyone gets back from Dunkirk. And he says, we must remember that wars are not won by evacuations, but this was still a miracle. So we do tend to focus on those stories, but there's something extraordinarily sort of heart-wrenching about the Arnhem story in the sense that you drop a whole load of people, 10,000 soldiers, well ahead, well behind enemy lines, and they're really waiting for rescue. So it's a race against time story. And the rescue never quite arrives. And meanwhile, the defenders are being sort of, gradually whittled down. And their defense of the bridge, which is where most of the action takes place in the heart of Arnhem, is utterly heroic and also very tragic at the same time. So I think it's a combination of heroism and tragedy that really sets this story apart.
And the film is based on Cornelius Ryan's book, The Bridge Too Far. And I couldn't help noticing, Saul, and I learnt this with Philip Blood and Gordon Corrigan. Cornelius Ryan has taken a bit of a battering, and I couldn't help noticing Ryan didn't really appear in your bibliography, I don't think, did he? And I'm not saying that as a criticism of you, Saul.
I think he does.
It's because he's really, I think his book's been rather kind of dismantled over the years, hasn't it?
That's probably going a little bit too far. And if he's not included in my bibliography, it's sort of partly an omission, but partly an admission that I didn't actually use the books per se, as I rarely use any other historian's books per se to construct my own narrative. I use the raw material. So I knew perfectly well that most of the interviews that he conducted, or at least that were conducted for him, and bear in mind, this is just 20 years after the event. So you've got things reasonably fresh in people's minds, were deposited in the Ohio State Archives. Quite well, why they ended up there, I'm not sure. Maybe he was an alumnus, but in any case, that's where they all are. So it was going back to the raw material that I was interested in rather than looking at his book specifically. But just to answer your broader question, which is that, has he been denigrated? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think what happens with whenever a feature film is made out of a history book, a non-fiction book, some liberties are taken. Maybe Cornelius Ryan, as an author himself, took the odd liberty. In other words, always choosing the best quote and the best story, as opposed to the one that he genuinely believed was accurate. But nevertheless, the basic beats of the story in both the book and the films, and I include The Longest Day here, are reasonably accurate. And the reason they're accurate is because they are based on an extraordinary amount of research done, admittedly with people who are actually there, rather than going, laboriously over the original planning and the after action reports, which is really the job of how can I put it, a more typical historian than Cornelius Ryan.
And the title itself, I don't want to dwell too much on A Bridge Too Far, but in your book you deal with this. In the quote, "A bridge too far," from the commander of the British Airborne Division, Boy Browning. There's some question as to whether this was said at the time to Montgomery during a pre-planning meeting or a planning meeting, and in fact is sort of added later because it sounds so good.
Well, there's no reliable source for it, is the truth of the matter, Ollie. And just to be specific about Browning, he was actually the deputy commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, which is the formation that carried out Operation Market Garden, or at least the airborne component, which is Operation Market. He was the deputy commander. He was also commanding the Airborne Corps, and of course, he was therefore in overall charge of the 1st British Airborne Division, which took the role there. So yes, he's the senior British Airborne commander rather than the commander of the 1st Airborne Division, who was of course Urquhart. And it states in Cornelius Ryan's book that this was actually a quote from him. Well, there's absolutely no evidence that he ever said it. So if that's a possible example of him thinking, what a great quote, we've got to use it. It's probably apocryphal, but we're going to use it anyway, in a way that a slightly more responsible historian probably would not have.
Good stuff, Saul. Well, we have a lot more of a responsible historian right here now. And so I'm always, when I read about Arnhem and Market Garden, I'm actually surprised that it went ahead, given that the plan seems to rely on so many things going right for it to succeed. If one element goes wrong, then the whole plan fails, it seems. And so with your military historian eye, having a look at the plan and all the different composites of it, what's your view on Operation Market Garden as a plan, as the military plan itself?
Well, they did make some fatal errors in the planning. It's understandable why they made those errors, because what you have when you plan a huge operation of this type, and we're talking about 3 airborne divisions, enormous numbers of soldiers. That's sort of 40 or 50,000 airborne soldiers alone. Then there's all the logistics to support them, all the planes to get them there, and then there is, of course, the army that is driving to meet them, the ground forces. I mean, it was an unbelievably ambitious plan, Ollie. And yet, if it had worked, if they really had managed to take this crossing over the Lower Rhine, it could have shortened the war. So was it a risk worth taking? And was it a plan, as you seem to be suggesting, doomed from the start? I mean, my answer to the first question is I think it was a risk worth taking, albeit it cost a lot of people their lives, but that's war. It's interesting that Urquhart says afterwards, Urquhart commanding the 1st Airborne Division, and the 1st Airborne Division loses 8,000 out of 10,000 men. So you might have imagined he might be a little bit embittered by the end of this operation. When I say 8,000, that's 8,000 killed, wounded, and captured, but it pretty much destroys the 1st Airborne Division. And he said, we'd happily do it again. We have no regrets. Now, is that sort of, the thing you expect him to say? I think he also partly believed it. I mean, Frost said the same thing. Frost commanding the 2nd Parachute Battalion, whose job was to take the bridge, the single hardest job. But Frost was also quite clear in his own mind that a lot of errors had been made, and they had been. But the reason errors are made in a massive operation of this type is because you've got conflicting priorities. You've got the airborne guys who are dropping the parachutists and towing the gliders, who don't want to be destroyed by flak. They are looking at the logistics of bringing in more than one lift in a single day and concluding, because we're now into autumn, that the days are short and there's simply not time to do that. So they're thinking of the safety and welfare of their own planes, their own pilots, their crew. And that's conflicting with what the airborne want on the ground, which is to get as many people in and around Arnhem as quickly as possible so they can capture the bridge and hold it for, they hope, 2 days. Meanwhile, you've got the ground forces, you've got 2 to 3 days. No one absolutely says you've got 48 hours to get there, but that's kind of implication. 48 to 36 hours. And if you can hold it for that long, job done. Well, they do manage to hold it for that long. So even though a lot of errors were made, they landed too far away from the bridges. They landed in multiple lifts, that is, over a number of different days, weakening the punching power of the 1st Airborne Division to get to its main objective, which is to capture the road bridge over the Lower Rhine. They do not use the coup de main option, which they'd used so successfully on D-Day. And by that, I mean you land a glider very close to the objective, you surprise the enemy, you've got a lot of guys at the right place at the right time, and then they get relieved by airborne, that is paratroopers coming in. That was the original plan, Ollie. The original plan was something called Operation Comet, and they had the coup de main element in not just the capture of Arnhem Bridge, but all the other bridges. And of course, the hold-up at Nijmegen Bridge was another of the big factors and the reason the operation didn't pull off. So I wouldn't say any one of those elements failing, the whole plan fails. A number of them fail. They have problems with the communication system. Urquhart goes missing for 36 hours at the beginning of the operation. Lathbury, who commands the 1st Parachute Brigade, whose job it is to capture the town and the bridge, puts in place what I consider to be a very poor plan. So one mistake after another, albeit with the benefit of hindsight, is made. And yet they still hold the bridge for more than 3 days. And if the ground troops had done their job, this would have been enough. So I know it's easy to sort of, cast aspersions. Anthony Beevor's book on Arnhem, absolutely fantastic book. And he concludes that there were too many moving parts to this operation. He doesn't absolutely say it, but he kind of implies it was doomed to failure. And I do not agree with that conclusion. I think all warfare, all airborne operations, and it's interesting having written a book about Sky Warriors all the way through, you can see how they're adapting and growing and learning from mistakes. But mistakes are always made, Ollie, and the plans are always imperfect. So I don't think it was doomed to fail. It came very close to succeeding. And if it had succeeded, it would almost certainly have lessened the war in terms of its time scale. It would have brought the collapse of Germany sooner. And here's the really important point, it would have almost certainly guaranteed that the Allies got deeper into Eastern Europe than they did in fact get. And that, of course, would have had a big implication in the post-war settlement of Eastern Europe.
Yes, that's an interesting point that perhaps isn't really appreciated when looking at the operation itself. The possibility of really reaching deep into Germany makes it worth the risk, I suppose. Yes.
There would still have been
Yeah,
issues
there's got a
with the
few more
Russians.
things
I
to
mean,
do. Yeah.
there would have still been an issue with no, but there would have still have been an issue with the Soviets. I mean, they'd already agreed a rough line in which they were going to partition Germany, with the Soviets coming from the east and the Allies coming from the west. But that doesn't mean if you're not in de facto control of places like Berlin and other cities in eastern Germany, and of course further south, Vienna, which was taken by the Soviets initially. Fortunately, Austria did remain this side of the Iron Curtain, but it could very easily have been the other way around. So Churchill was very, as I'm sure you know, Ollie, was very clear in his mind that he was already looking to the post-war settlement and the danger that the Soviets were going to dominate Eastern Europe. And he knew trouble was lying ahead if that happened. And he was urging Montgomery and other forces in Italy to get as far eastern Europe as get as far east into Europe as possible to guarantee that the Soviet curtain wouldn't get as far west as it ultimately did.
Well, your book covers the Battle of Arnhem on a sort of day by day basis, which is great, really clear about what happens on each day. Because battles are always confusing things for the layman like myself, reading about the intricate movements of different regiments, battalions. I'm probably getting the terminology wrong, but what's interesting is that Frost lands, and his job is just to get to the bridge, and he's got a few miles to go to get to the bridge. As you mentioned, there's no glider landing near the bridge like at Pegasus. So Frost gets there quickly, but he doesn't have it all his own way, does he, once he arrives at the bridge?
No, I think the first day really is the key to the success or failure of the operation. I mean, I've already pointed out that ultimately they do hold the bridge for three days and 4 nights, and that was enough. Yet they could have held out an awful lot longer if they got more troops to the bridge on day one. So you kind of think here are the various possibilities, Ollie. The plan would have been much more effective if everyone had got there on day one. I already talked about the lifts, So in effect, you drop a parachute brigade and an air landing brigade. We'll come back to Frost in a second. On day one, and the air landing brigade, which are dropped by gliders, their job is now to protect the landing zones, which are 6 to 8 miles from the center of Arnhem and the road bridge, for the lift that's coming in the following day and the day after. In other words, they're redundant to the battle for Arnhem, at least for 24 hours. Now, if that whole force, that whole air landing force, with 1st Parachute Brigade, that is the 3 parachute battalions, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, had all headed together for the center of town, they almost certainly would have been strong enough in these early hours when the Germans were still reacting to what was going on, to have got there and set up a pretty strong perimeter. But what you actually had is the plan as it existed, which is 1st air landing don't go anywhere. So you've just got 3 parachute battalions. The main job is given to 2nd Parachute Battalion, which is to take the bridge. But the other 2 parachute battalions, 1 and 3, are also given very important jobs, because their job is to set up the perimeter around the town of Arnhem proper. And they're all heading in on a separate roadway. So, this is to give them the greatest chance to get there at speed. But what does it do if you divide a parachute brigade into 3? It reduces its punching power. So if each one of those battalions meets opposition on the way into Arnhem, there's the danger that a relatively small force well dug in opposing them is going to hold them up. Now, if you've got all 3 of them together, or all 3 of them in close touch, they can maneuver around that obstacle and maybe overwhelm it. And what you actually had on the first day, that is the 17th of September at Arnhem, is a single parachute battalion, that is the 2nd Parachute Battalion, Frost, managing to get through, because it's on the southerly route, the route closest to the river, and that's the route that the Germans haven't sealed off yet. But the other 2 battalions on the middle route and the northerly route, they are both, by the time they get close to the outskirts of Arnhem, the Germans have rallied and are in a position to stop them. I mean, it's incredibly bad luck, actually, Ollie, that on the day that the landings took place, an SS replacement battalion, a very effective formation, not huge in numbers, but quite well equipped. It's got a number of raw recruits, actually. So they're not veteran troops, but they are pretty determined. They're well officered and they've got some good NCOs. just happened to be on maneuvers very close to where the landings took place. And they react very quickly and set up these blocking positions, which are then reinforced by troops sent in an emergency by what was known as the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, which happened to be refitting in the area. The information that they were refitting in the area had actually come through to Browning, but he'd kind of brushed it under the carpet. He thought, well, we don't want any bad news to delay this operation, because someone might say we need to postpone it again. And it is worth pointing out that 1st Airborne Division before Arnhem had 15 operations cancelled. It missed out on D-Day, and it was desperate to get into action, as was Browning. So you can see that everyone was determined to do this operation. They were kind of ignoring bad news, and it just so happened on the day in question, as I say, of those 3 battalions heading into Arnhem, 2 of them are stopped, partly because of bad luck and the Germans in the right place at the right time. But they do certainly react very quickly, and they fight very ferociously. That is the Germans.
Is that intelligence that Browning received from intelligence officer also named Browning, was that something that, in previous operations, you'd get similar intelligence, but such was the requirement, what such is the sort of drive, the need, you would generally, well, you've said brush it under the carpet. Is that kind of standard approach, or is what Browning did, brushing it under the carpet, is that something that really, that was poor form and that shouldn't have happened?
No, it's a very good question, actually, Ollie, because again, having the perspective I've got of writing about Sky Warriors all the way through the Second World War, you can see the operations that they developed. Now, by 1944, it's pretty sophisticated. If you look at the files for the planning and intelligence and logistics for any of these operations, it's thousands of pages long. If you want to read through it laboriously, you can get it all at the National Archives. But it shows you the level of planning they're going into, and yet, nevertheless, despite their so-called, heavy files of intelligence, not all of it is accurate. So yes, this information was coming in, but they don't always believe the intelligence. They certainly drop a lot of these guys in the Second World War with an incomplete intelligence picture. And it just so happened that on this particular occasion, the information coming through about the presence of these 2 SS Panzer divisions, that's the 9th and 10th, and also these photo reconnaissance pictures that came through, I think on about the 15th of September, that's only a couple of days before, confirming that there was armor in the area. Well, you could say on the one hand it was irresponsible. On the other hand, there'd be many instances where the intelligence picture was complete. I think the imperative of people in Airborne to do something because they were missing out was a very, very powerful factor for Browning. He was personally ambitious. And he also believed that the German collapse, because there'd been a relative collapse in the German opposition since the end of the Normandy campaign and the so-called Great Swan, that is the incredibly quick drive across northern France and into Belgium, where they advanced something like 250 miles in 10 days. I think that led everyone to believe that the Germans were almost finished as a fighting force. Now, again, that was hopelessly inaccurate, but you can understand why they might have thought that. And certainly people like Browning, who'd fought in the First World War, and I think other people referenced this, other people who were serving at him at the time, people on his staff were saying, Browning was thinking this is another 1918 scenario. We've finally cracked the Germans, we've got them on the run, and it's going to be, backwards all the way to the Reich, which is why we can take a chance on an operation like this.
Well, you've mentioned Urquhart, the commander of the 1st Airborne Division, and he is an interesting fellow, actually, because he doesn't have a paratroop background when he's appointed to this command, does he? And in addition to that, he, as you've mentioned, he goes missing quite early on in the operation. And this makes for a bit of a nightmare for him, really. Let's be honest.
Yeah, he is someone who doesn't really understand what airborne troops can do. The reason he's appointed is he is an acolyte, a protege of Montgomery. I mean, Montgomery's armies, and you won't be surprised to hear this, senior commanders are always appointed because the main commander, Montgomery in this case, commanding the army group, had looked at what Urquhart had done in a previous role and been quite impressed. Well, actually, he'd been on the staff a lot, and staff officers don't always make best field commanders, but he'd also commanded something called 231 Independent Brigade, in Sicily, and Montgomery felt he'd done really well. And because it's an independent brigade, it's not operating in a kind of divisional format. He felt that maybe that Urquhart would be very suitable for an airborne role where you are effectively independent. But he completely misunderstood the business of airborne soldiering, because what Urquhart felt with airborne troops, and he's on the record about this, is that they're basically infantry delivered from the air, and once they're on the ground, they fight like infantry. Well, that's not true at all. They fight in a very different way because of the nature of airborne warfare, which is that you're never going to have heavy weapons. In other words, Ollie, yes, you've got to fight very aggressively, but you can't fight that for long. It's not a typical infantry slogging match. And as soon as you get into one with airborne troops, you've got a major problem. You need to get enough of them into a defensive position as quickly as possible around whatever strategic location they've been directed to capture, and you've got to relieve them as quickly as possible. The idea that they can simply be landed in the middle of nowhere and then fight as ordinary infantry simply isn't true. They have a different psychological makeup, and ordinary infantry soldiers do not, generally speaking, get landed in the middle of nowhere. They are used to supply lines, they're used to regular sort of food, and the whole psychology of fighting is different for infantry men. And I think the behavior of Urquhart on the day he arrived, which is to leave headquarters because the communications were poor and to go forward to find out what was going on, also underlines his misunderstanding of airborne warfare, which is that you drop a lot of people behind enemy lines and the enemy are all around and you don't quite know where they are. So, frankly, for a divisional commander to go forward in an airborne scenario is always a very dangerous thing to do, because what you've got with airborne troops is they're infiltrated between the enemy. That's what was intended at Arnhem. And you don't know how many enemy have been left behind. Therefore, there's a very high chance that people following on are going to become casualties. And of course, that's acceptable if they're reinforcement troops, but it's not acceptable if they're a divisional commander. So again, I think that was an element of naivety, overconfidence. I've got to show these guys what's what. And he paid dearly for it, because he's effectively out of the running. I think I said for 36 hours, which is the first 2 nights of the battle and the second day of the battle, when really it's won or lost.
It's really interesting that, because in your book, I was fascinated to read about the row that then breaks out. Well, maybe I'm over exaggerating, but the row that breaks out when Urquhart's out the game, stuck in a local Arnhem resident's attic, accompanied by a fellow officer with a huge moustache. But your description of the row that breaks out between his subordinates, who argue over who's more senior and therefore who should be directing operations, is I think a couple of brigadiers. One has been appointed earlier than the other, thinks he's more senior, but Urquhart, sort of last minute, almost seems to change the hierarchy.
Yeah, well, exactly right. And remember this is the consequence of Urquhart going missing. If he doesn't go missing, we don't have any of this problem. But Urquhart had laid out quite clearly the order of seniority if anything happened to him. First of all, Brigadier Lathbury takes over and he commands 1st Parachute Battalion. But Brigadier Lathbury is already following the 1st Parachute Brigade into Arnhem. And actually, there's a moment where Lathbury and Urquhart and Lieutenant Colonel Fitch, who's commanding the 3rd Parachute Battalion, are all together in the same location. This is the evening of the 17th, trying to head into Arnhem. Now, it's complete madness if you think about a chain of command and how it's going to operate well, that you've got these 3 senior officers all in the same place. It does go properly pear-shaped, because the next day Lathbury gets wounded. He's now out of action. And Urquhart, as you say, is marooned by Germans all around and is hiding in an attic. So now you've left with 2 senior officers, Brigadier Hicks, who's commanding the 1st Air Landing Brigade, and he's been there from the start, from the 17th, and Brigadier Hackett, who's arrived with the 2nd lift, that's the 4th Parachute Brigade, and they've arrived slightly late, so they're not there until the afternoon of the 18th. And it's at this point that there's a tremendous row between the 2 of them, because Urquhart has left orders that if Lathbury goes missing, he was his number 1 nomination, and of course he's now wounded, then Hicks should take over. And yet Hicks is not as senior in terms of strict army seniority as Hackett, which is why Hackett is pretty pissed off when he arrives and is told that Hicks is in command. He's also pretty pissed off because Hicks has taken one of his battalions, I think it's the 11th Parachute Battalion, and ordered it to reinforce the move into Arnhem, which was not actually in itself a bad idea, because the guys at the bridge desperately needed reinforcements. About 700 of them get there, and they only get a few dribs and drabs thereafter, 50 here and 20 there. And meanwhile, of course, they're being degraded in numbers, ammunition and supplies by these fierce counterattacks the Germans are putting in on the guys holding the defensive positions around the north end of the bridge. The other important point to make is that by not assigning a separate coup de main force to the south of the bridge, not dropping some paratroopers or gliders there, they only actually control one half of the bridge, and that is another disaster waiting to happen. All bridge operations require you to hold both ends. Having said that, if you're going to hold one end, hold the north end, because the south end is where the relieving troops are going to come from, and they can fight a battle for control of that, and you can probably support that battle, of course, because you hold the other end of the bridge.
Well, there's this furious fighting at the bridge. It's so it's like heartbreaking to read, actually, but it is extraordinary. And you have these SS Panzer soldiers fighting the paratroopers. Now, the paratroopers, as you say, are not equipped with hugely heavy weapons. They've got the Piat. Now, Saul, the Piat. I mean, I've always thought this is a pretty rubbish piece of kit. I'd love to know the percentage of success it has when you fire it. Is it any good?
Well, it did actually prove to be pretty good. So it is much maligned, Ollie. You're right, and the soldiers at the time took the mickey out of it because it looked pretty unwieldy. And I think so it had two big problems. It took a very long time to reload, and you had to maneuver it with your foot on the ground to actually get the cocking mechanism back in place, and that couldn't be done when you were lying down. So you've got to stand up to do it. So really, I would describe it as a sort almost a one-shot weapon, which is you've got to hit the target with the first shot. Otherwise, that whatever you're trying to hit, be it a Panzer or a half-track, armored half-track, is going to know that it's under assault and it's going to take you out. So the distance at which it's fairly accurate is really 30 to 50 yards. It can far further than that, but the chance of hitting anything at about 100 yards, for example, are vanishingly small. So you've got to wait until the last minute. But nevertheless, there are extraordinary examples of heroism in which they're using these Piats. So one guy called Private Ligo, I think it's on the 19th. It's either on the 19th or the 20th, when there's a really heavy armored attack being put in by panzers, 4 panzers. He on his own manages to fight off these 4 panzers. He disables one, hits another, partially disabling it, and drives the other 2 off. So, there I am saying it's a one-shot weapon. He's proven that that's not strictly the case. An unbelievable act of heroism. And what was his reward, Ollie? A military medal, which is the kind of lowest grade of gallantry cross. So you can see that the paratroopers, a little bit like the special forces, are expected to do extraordinary things, and it's got to be unbelievably extraordinary for you to get more than the basic gallantry medal. Something like, for example, the DSO, and then of course the VC. 5 VCs were awarded, but for the incredible defense of Arnhem, 1 to a pilot, and that's because we could tell you enormous numbers of stories like the Ligo story, but there are 1 or 2 that really do stand out, and they undoubtedly deserve VCs.
And who can forget? Is it Sergeant Thornton back at Pegasus Bridge? He got a VC was it a Piat he was using?
No, but you've hit the nail on the head. You're absolutely right. It was Thornton. Yes, it was a Piat. Yes, he probably saved the bridge. And what did he get? An MM. So no, he didn't get a VC. And that's the point. I mean, I think you've got to do something pretty extraordinary.
So, okay, we've got Frost's men at the bridge. Really, the British are in 2 separate groups, aren't they? Frost at the bridge, and then at Oosterbeek, based around the hotel, the headquarters, and then a large number of paratroopers there. And they can't link up, which means basically the operation is probably doomed to failure.
Well, and still not entirely doomed to failure, which is the point I was making at the beginning of our conversation, Ollie, because of course, in an ideal world, if you get more troops to the bridge, they could have held out longer. And yet their objective is to hold that bridge for 2, maybe 3 days. And what they actually do, there are still a few of them holding out, not really in control of the bridge any longer, by the morning of the 21st. So that's day 5. So you've certainly got, but put it like this: if 30 Corps, which is the armored ground element, which is coming to relieve them, had been able to get to the southern end of the bridge by the evening of the 20th, and that's into day 4, so that's 4 days into the operation, they still would have succeeded. So even though they didn't get those troops through to the bridge to allow the force there, which is being whittled down, to be reinforced, replenished, and to be able to hold out for longer, they still theoretically held out long enough if everyone else had done their job, which are the ground troops. So then the focus shifts a little bit to what's going on, in particular to what's going on at Nijmegen, which is the next major bridge. Because if you've got to hold up at Nijmegen, obviously they can't get on to Arnhem. Eventually, that Nijmegen defensive posture by the Germans is overwhelmed by an incredibly heroic kind of paddling across the river by the German, I think it's the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and an armored attack by the spearhead of 30 Corps goes in at the same time, and they take Nijmegen Bridge, and that is that takes place on the morning, I think it's the afternoon of the 20th, and if they'd carried on going straight away and gone cross country, they might have been able to get to the north end of the bridge, but actually they stop. They feel we need to replenish. You know, the caution there was all the way along the line from the commander of 30 Corps, and that was Brian Horrocks, but also from Browning, who was insisting that the American paratroopers, in particular the 82nd Airborne, whose job was to capture Nijmegen, well, they actually needed to take a tactical feature to the south of Nijmegen called the Groesbeek Heights, because he was worried about a German counterattack, which was never put in. I mean, yes, it could have been from the Reichswald Forest. Instead of saying to the 82nd Airborne, your single key objective is to capture Nijmegen as quickly as possible. And that was never done. They could arguably have captured it on day 1, and they never did. They never got it until the 20th. So many errors made along the way, and not all of them relating to the responsibility of 1st Airborne to capture the bridge at Arnhem.
Yes, well, let's look at 30 Corps then briefly, because as you mentioned, there's this key, they've captured Nijmegen, this brilliant act of heroism from the American 82nd, who carry out this sort of suicidal amphibious assault to the other side of the Rhine. Is it the Rhine or the Waal?
Waal River.
Yes, the Waal River. And so they have the bridge, and then as you've mentioned, 30 Corps, the job is then to just drive like hell, to quote Horrocks, and head to Arnhem. But what they do is they stop. Now, I think this is the Grenadier Guards at the spear point of 30 Corps. And this is, it sounds from what you were saying, they did show a little bit too much caution there.
Yeah, and this wasn't the first time, actually, Ollie. I mean, that's the key moment, I suppose, in terms of the last opportunity of getting to the final bridge. But there has been undue caution, as indeed even Horrocks himself admitted after the event, from day 1. If there'd been more drive on day 1, I mean, they stopped, for example, in the first 24 hours because they hear that a bridge further ahead has been blown up, and it's going to take time to get the bridging material and the engineers to put in a makeshift bridge. But nevertheless, by stopping, they held up the engineering kit coming through. So you need to get all the way to whatever the location is, and then clear your vehicles off the road so the engineering kit can come through. I mean, it was just utterly mystifying, that initial decision. And this same lack of drive was partly 30 Corps all the way through. I think you said it was the Grenadiers up front. Well, it was certainly there was Guards armor. I think they swapped over who was actually at the point of the spear. I mean,
you are not allowed to criticize the Irish Guards on this podcast, Saul.
I wondered why you slipped away from the Irish Guards. So the Irish Guards are at the point of the spear at various times. Vandeleur. I don't know if that's a famous name in the Irish Guards, Ollie. You'll know.
I think Vandeleur and his cousin. Yes, I think they are quite famous.
Yeah, but Vandeleur and his cousin. But they command separate battalions of the Irish Guards. But the other battalions, as you say, are the Grenadiers, and I think it's the Grenadiers who are at the spear point when they cross Nijmegen. Now, it's not their decision to halt. To be fair, it's Horrocks and the divisional commander who make the decision to stop there. They need to replenish and resupply. And it was Would they have definitely got through? Would they have definitely relieved the bridge? Well, we simply don't know. But this was the last opportunity for them to do so, and it's just another example of the kind of lack of drive. The American parachutists, by the way, who'd captured the bridge at such great cost to themselves, were infuriated at this kind of lack of determination to push on, and thought, well, why do we all die in vain? Because they aren't even bothering to try and get to the final objective, which was Arnhem.
That's the most heartbreaking thing, actually, because Julian Cook, the commander of that battalion, lost so many of his men crossing. I mean, just the idea that you would then stop. Exactly, it does seem like a waste, but I suppose that's again war. Frost, by this time, I think, has surrendered, hasn't he?
Well, Frost is wounded actually on the. I think it's the morning of the 20th. So if we consider to be 20 now, Al Murray, by the way, who you might well be speaking to at some point, has written a whole book on a single day of the Arnhem battle, and it's a very clever idea because he's chosen the 19th, which sort of in his mind is, they wake up that morning still with hope, and by the time they go to bed, it's all over. I wouldn't go quite so far as that, but it definitely is a big hinge day in terms of expecting a relief and still thinking we can hold on. And what's clever about the book is that it allows you to see it from the perspective, not from a historian's perspective, but from the perspective of the guys at the time who, amongst all the chaos, still had, hope that they could be rescued. And you really get a sense of what the battle must have been like for the ordinary soldier on the ground, completely chaotic. But in my view, the 20th, there is still hope. And on the 20th, that's when Frost himself is wounded. I mean, it's amazing it hadn't happened before. He's wounded by mortar fire, which is what got most people, actually, most of the casualties. I think someone did an after-action report in which they looked at the battle casualties caused at Arnhem, and 90% of them were shell fire and mortar fire. And that's probably replicated right the way through the war, actually. But particularly in this built-up area, not a lot of people actually wounded or killed by bullets. It was mainly by shrapnel. And Frost himself is badly wounded in the legs by shrapnel. So he's taken into what has become the kind of makeshift brigade aid post, which is in the basement, of course, of a building near to the bridge. And there are another 200 or 300 people in there. I mean, it's an absolute charnel house. And, the medics do an amazing job. It's another of the sort of, the great unheralded aspects of war, putting their lives on the line, but treating all these guys. And it must have been clear. I mean, Frost was finally persuaded by the guy who took over from him, which was Hibbert, who was the brigade major, and also Goff, who was commanding the reconnaissance battalion, that probably now was the time to say to, those who wanted to get away, they could, but everyone else was going to surrender. So Frost himself and all those poor wounded in the basement were taken into captivity. But of course, it could have been worse. I mean, the building was on fire, and if the Germans hadn't got them out, pretty much everyone would have perished. So certainly it was time.
And we haven't really mentioned the Poles either, because they reinforce and struggle because of where they land. I think their landing zone is captured, isn't it? And also the Dutch civilians who suffer terribly in Arnhem, and indeed at Nijmegen.
Yeah, well, the Poles are an interesting story in themselves. I mean, they were an absolutely integral part of the plan, but they were due to come in last. So the original plan has them coming in on the 19th. They finally arrive on the 21st. I mean, it's which goes to show that the other element that can get in the way of airborne operations is weather. And so if you have all the lifts going in one go, if the operation is cancelled, fine. But when you do get the right weather, which was on the 17th, the weather was clear, it's perfect weather for airborne operations, then everyone can land at the same time. But if you've got these multiple lifts, then the weather can change. And that's exactly what happened. The weather wasn't great in the morning of the 18th, so 4th Parachute Brigade had delayed. And the weather was, made it impossible to carry out airborne operations on the 19th and part of the 20th. And so most of the Poles don't arrive until the 21st, by which time the battle's already over. And that's the real tragedy of the Poles. And they actually carry out a crossing to try and reinforce what's now the marooned remnants of 1st Airborne Division in and around the Oosterbeek perimeter. And some of them do get across, but also a lot of them lose their lives in the attempt. So the story of the Poles is really one of disaster, arriving too late, and Sosabowski, who was the Polish commander, being blamed for making errors of his own, completely unfairly, in my view. And his career and reputation were effectively destroyed as a result of this. And of course, some people have inevitably argued that this was other people in airborne, in particular Browning, trying to make scapegoats over the Poles, which was, as I say, unjustifiable. The Dutch civilians, well, about 400 of them are killed in the actual Arnhem operation itself. Maybe more than that, actually. Maybe it was more like 800. But anyway, under 1,000. It's the tragedy of Arnhem is that because we don't capture the Lower Rhine and we're not able to then drive deeper into Holland, Holland is pretty much left under German occupation, or at least the bit that's still under German occupation after the Arnhem operation, until the end of the war. And the Germans lash out in a sort of typically brutal fashion and effectively starve the population. Or put it another way, Ollie, don't make sure that they get supplies in there to to feed the Dutch. And I think it's estimated that up to 30,000 of them die of hunger during that bitter winter of 1944 to 1945.
So this is probably a good place to end it, because as you've mentioned, 2,000 of the 10,000 paratroopers get out, but the operation is sort of classified as, or described as, I think 90% successful. And the Crown Prince of the Netherlands, I think, says, "I don't think my nation can endure another Montgomery success." So when the sort of dust settles, was it 90% successful?
Well, it was, in the sense that the First Allied Airborne Army, that is the Operation Market element, had something like 18 river crossings to capture, and they capture all of them apart from the last one. Now, you could argue also, justifiably, that the last one is the single most important one, and yet, nevertheless, they do drive, an incredibly long distance into Holland, which is going to be very useful for the next stage of Allied operations. Yes, of course, it would have been a game changer if they got across the Rhine. They don't finally get across the Rhine, Lower Rhine or Main Rhine itself in Germany, until the following March. So you can see this as a 6-month delay, really, and therefore they, as we discussed earlier, they're going to be much further from getting deep into Germany as a result of this. That's a direct result of not capturing the last bridge. So you could say both points are right. Yes, ultimately the operation didn't succeed, but it wasn't for nothing. And the distance they gained and the glory, let's face it, the First Airborne Division were given as a result of this, are something. The famous quote, I always like to end, and I did end the chapter, my final chapter on Arnhem in the book, with the Montgomery quote, which is, it'll be great for any man to be able to say, I fought in Arnhem, every man an emperor, as he says after the Second World War. But his specific business about Arnhem is, it'll be wonderful in times to come to say, I fought at Arnhem.
Well, I think, Saul, we should leave it there with that wonderful line from Montgomery. And so, listeners, links are in the show notes. Saul's brilliant book doesn't just deal with Arnhem, deals with all the airborne operations throughout the Second World War. And Saul, can you come back and talk about perhaps the most successful of all, Operation Varsity, which I wasn't really familiar with it, but it's a huge success, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the lessons, and yes, I can. It took
Brilliant.
place in March 1945, and it was the operation that allowed the British Montgomery to cross the Rhine finally in another ground airborne operation. Only this time they'd learned all the lessons of Arnhem, and they made sure that they did deliver everyone in one lift. They did make sure that their objectives weren't very far from the landing zones, and they did make sure that the distance between where they landed the airborne and where the ground troops were starting was only a relatively small distance. And all those three things made a tremendous difference, and the end result was a very successful operation. There were heavy casualties, as I will explain when we talk about it, Ollie, but nevertheless, it was a unbelievably successful operation, and described by, I think it's Eisenhower, who's of course Supreme Commander, as the most successful airborne operation of the war.
Great stuff. Saul, this is fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thanks so much for listening. Fascinating and compelling stuff from Saul there. Remember, the series continues, so don't forget to share, rate and review, and follow. But until then, thank you and good night.